Professor, good evening, and thank you for accepting our offer and being part of the evening news on Sitel TV.
Thank you for having me.
You're an expert in your field, and today we're going to talk a lot about your research, which is about foreign interference and information manipulation. But first of all, let's just clarify for our audience. Can you please explain the title of your research? And after that, can you please specify the differences between the terms disinformation and FIMI, which is the title of your research?
Yeah, so the research paper that I prepared for this presentation in the Macedonian Parliament is looking at the different approaches that you can take in order to increase resilience to foreign information manipulation in a country, specifically in North Macedonia. And when it comes to the question what foreign information manipulation is, it is one of the many challenges that you can experience, or one of the many challenges to information integrity that you have these days in the digital environment. Information integrity would mean that there needs to be an information space in every country which can help you make informed decisions as a citizen, which can help you learn what's happening in politics, what are the relevant topics, what's happening in the world. And if you have too many manipulations, that means that certain aspects might look too dominant in this, or you might have too many sources of information that are unreliable. You might not be able to determine what information you can trust and what information you cannot trust. And in this context, the other term that is often used is disinformation. The difference between FIMI and disinformation is that disinformation only looks at the truth behind a piece of content, or whether it's factual or not, while FIMI is looking at the sources of this information threat, so that it comes from outside of the country, but it doesn't necessarily have to be disinformation. It can also be a hack and leak attack. It can also be coordinated inauthentic activity, so basically when lots of bots are amplifying certain messages. But there's also an overlap. There's also foreign disinformation that is considered FIMI. Like, for example, there were these two big information attacks in the last years, the Pravda movement and the Doppelganger, which were basically creating websites that looked like established, well-known websites in the European Union, but the content that was published was made up fake articles on these sites.
We live in one digital world where the information flows fast, but the disinformation somehow spreads even faster. We have a lot of new, easily available digital platforms, new technologies, and especially the artificial intelligence, a tool that we are still adapting on. So when I was with all this new technology, it's kind of very hard to adapt or to stay resilient to the disinformation. But while I was reading your research, the thing that caught my eye is the phrase that you mentioned, that the low resilience to disinformation is due to social inequality. What are the consequences of such conditions in Macedonia?
Well, social inequality is one of the conditions, because we have to think of resilience in terms of the resilience of a society. So if there is a society where there are lots of inequalities, then as a foreign actor who amplifies certain harmful pieces of content can use these divisions in society. So if some people are poorer than others and they feel bad about that, then of course you can send them messages that will further this, that will lead to even more bad feelings towards other parts of society. Or the same with linguistic minorities in a country, marginalized groups. You can target them, and the lower the trust in society, or the lower the levels of education in society, or the access to certain services, the more chances you have to create something bad with targeted messages.
What is the current European legislation, and can a small country like ours, which is a country candidate, can actually implement realistically all of the obligations that are coming from the EU tools for filming. I'm talking about the Digital Services Act, European Media Freedom Act, but without increasing the administrative burden.
It's possible that you can't introduce everything just because you're not part of the European Union, and it will be hard to be part of all of the discussions, but I think as a first step it would be very important for the relevant agencies and regulators to be part of the of some conversations, to have good connections with, for example, the Digital Services Board and the Board for Media Services that are related to the European Media Freedom Act and the Digital Services Act. And to have discussions with other experts and regulators in the European Union in order to figure out what is it where the European Union can help. Like, for example, there is a huge emphasis on systemic risks in the Digital Services Act, but systemic risks are problems that that affect the whole system, so not just one country specifically, but multiple countries, sometimes millions or tens of millions of people. So those are threats that you cannot address on the level of just one country. So there you need to have cooperation. But certain other aspects can be easily implemented, especially what's written in the media, in the European Media Freedom Act, because it's basically a number of different regulations, or no, different requirements that are already part of many international codes or best practices of journalism, and in an optimal scenario all countries would need to have them. The problem is that now even in the richest countries in the world, the independent and quality news media is suffering from a crisis. There isn't enough money to create quality journalism, and that also leads to a lack of trust in society because they don't know what to trust in. So definitely the media-related measures can be easily implemented. When it comes to digital services, it's much harder because we are talking about services and companies that are bigger than certain states that have hundreds of millions of users, and of course as one country alone you cannot tackle them. You need to really rely on the European Union and all the partners that the country has in order to address this. And when it comes to the question of what the regulations are that the European Union has in this area, there are these two that were mentioned before, the Digital Services Act and the European Media Freedom Act. But the European approach focusing on disinformation and FIMI is about a decade old. It started with the establishment of the Stratcom, the Strategic Communications Agency of the European Union, which is monitoring disinformation and strategically communicating to minimize the harms of it. There's a bunch of different policy papers that were published focusing on the European approach to disinformation, which is basically about the transparency of online services and about protecting fundamental rights and human rights, because it would be very easy to introduce legislation that penalizes publishers of disinformation, but if we create an environment in which you can be fined or even put into prison for publishing certain content that is not true, even sometimes without knowing yourself whether the thing that you publish is true or not, we would have a significant chilling effect on freedom of expression. So the European approach is about making services responsible and at the same time also protecting freedom of expression as much as possible, and at the same time increasing resilience in society by supporting media literacy, fact-checking and some other activities.
Yeah, in your research you call for a careful local assessment before aligning our legislation and practices with those of the European Union. What exactly do you mean by that?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily about aligning. the regulations with the European Union, but I think more in general when it comes to creating a regulatory environment that aims to address the risks of FEMI and disinformation, you need to understand how the institutions work in a specific country, what is the level of media literacy, what is the quality of the media, because that all defines and impacts what policies you can use. Because you cannot just look at some best practices from other countries and implement them, because maybe what works fine in Finland or Sweden might not work necessarily in North Macedonia, because you have different conditions, different habits, different levels of trust in institutions, and yeah, for that reason, you have to assess what's happening in the given country, and then adapt the different tools that you can use. Yeah.
You mentioned yourself that different European countries have different approach while battling the disinformation. In your opinion, via your expertise, which example is the most suitable for Macedonia as a small country, and why?
I would say that the best approach is probably that of the Baltic countries and Finland, because they emphasize media literacy. So for them it's really important to educate their population, to make sure that they can make sense of what they are reading. And in general, media literacy, in my opinion, is one of the most effective tools against disinformation, because if you have a media literate society, then you might have disinformation in the country on different online platforms, but members of your society will be able to spot disinformation and understand that they shouldn't trust it. And of course, if they understand that something is harmful content, they are also less likely to share it, to like it, to republish it. So yeah, that's definitely one of the most important approaches. And I would also say that these countries can also be good examples for Macedonia, because they are much smaller than the rest of the EU. So a small country approach is probably much better for Macedonia than looking at what Germany or France are doing, because they just have different challenges, different resources. So of course Germany or France can have, or they can invest in a huge apparatus that can monitor different trends, that can have a strong strategic communications department and so on. But it needs a lot of investment, and I think many countries cannot afford that.
Yeah, France and Germany are the first two countries, I think, the lead ones in 2017, who are actually following all of the obligation from the EU tools about fighting disinformation, and those are the two lead countries that are above everyone while managing the disinformation. But as an expert, do you support penalization or institutional responses in the fight against the disinformation? And yes, in which kind of situation?
I wouldn't support it at all. I mean, in the case of foreign information manipulation, it doesn't really make sense anyway, because in the case of foreign information manipulation, the sources of disinformation come from outside of the country, so you cannot really penalize someone who's not under your jurisdiction. But even in other cases, it's just hard to introduce a system in which you penalize people for publishing certain pieces of content, because it could be misused if you have a change in government, or if you have if you have a government that doesn't respect the rule of law, then it could misuse this. It can have a chilling effect on free communications, and at the same time it's also very important to emphasize that disinformation as such is not illegal. So simply just lying about the facts is not a crime. Of course, there are some cases in which you can justify penalizing disinformation, like for example, if it can cause significant harm, like for example if you would publish something about a terror attack taking place in the country and then it causes panic. But in 90% of the cases, or I don't know, let's not use the percentages, but in most cases disinformation is just not illegal and it cannot be penalized. So of course I mentioned cases like causing panic or some other significant potential harms to the integrity of elections or to managing a crisis like a public health crisis. In those cases you can probably rely on penalizing the publishers, but if you would look at the costs and benefits, you would probably realize that there are just too many people who you would need to go after. You wouldn't have the capacities to do that properly, so why not rather increase resilience in society so that people are just not affected by this kind of content?
The line between the sanctions and actually protecting the freedom of speech is very thin. How can we maintain balance at this area?
Yeah, that's very hard, and that's why I'm saying that it's better not to use sanctions, but rather enable society to spot disinformation and to respond to disinformation content.
At the end of your research, you were writing there are a lot of recommendations for everyone involved in this cycle. You have recommendations for the government, for the media houses, for the journalists, and for the politicians. The one thing that caught my eye was your recommendation for the government. You suggest that the government should create a strategy against foreign interference and information manipulation. What should this strategy look like?
I think the best example for a strategy is the one that was developed in Ireland. They have set up an expert commission to assess how a strategy could look like and how different institutions could cooperate. But basically, the idea behind the strategy is to have a long-term understanding of the risks of disinformation and how you want to tackle it, and to follow a whole of society approach, meaning that you want to include all segments of society, but you also want to include different policy fields in it, so you can't just use the, I don't know, defense services, but you also have to look at education professionals, the media, of course, civil society, and together you can create an environment in which society will over time become more resilient. And also a strategy, if you have it, it should also be independent of changes in politics. So you have to build it in a way that even if there is a change in government, you will not completely change the strategy, but you will share the ideas and just continue doing this mission in the future.
Mr. Conrad, thank you so much for the messages and this interview.
Thank you.